I was still paying for their house, their lifestyle, and their child's education when I found out I was no longer welcome at Christmas. One message, four words that cut deeper than any argument. No drama. And then the moment that broke something in me forever. My own son hit like. No call, no explanation, just quiet agreement. In that instant, I understood the truth I had avoided for years. I wasn't family anymore. I was funding. And the moment I stopped being convenient, I became disposable. This is the story of how that realization changed everything. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Plime Carolyn Whitmore, and I am 62 years old. I live in Scottsdale, Arizona, in a quiet neighborhood where the streets curve gently and the houses all seem to promise comfort and stability. From the outside, my life looks settled, even enviable. I am a widow, financially secure, retired early after years of building something with my own hands. People assume that a woman my age, in a place like this, has already figured everything out. What they do not see is how easily a life can look full while quietly being emptied. My husband died years ago, suddenly, before we had finished making plans for the future we thought we had earned. When he was gone, everything fell on me at once. Grief did not come with a pause button. Bills still arrived, responsibilities did not soften, and my son still needed a mother who could stand upright even when she wanted to fold. I learned very quickly how to survive by staying busy. I worked longer hours, built my chain of physical therapy clinics into something reliable, something valuable. Work gave me structure. Providing gave me purpose. When I eventually sold the business, people congratulated me on my success. I smiled and thanked them, but inside, I told myself the truth. I did not sell it to enjoy freedom. I sold it to make sure my son would never struggle. Daniel was my only child, and loving him had become the axis around which every decision in my life turned. Helping him felt natural, almost automatic. I believe that was what good mothers did. Daniel is 36 now, a real estate agent who prefers flexibility to stability. He married Vanessa, a woman who speaks the language of wellness, lifestyle, and curated happiness. She knows how to make a home look warm on a screen, how to turn everyday moments into something aspirational. Together, they have two children, Ethan and Lily, my grandchildren. When they were born, I felt something open inside me that I did not know was still there. Loving them felt effortless. Protecting them felt instinctive. The house they live in, a 4-bedroom place with a pool and a shaded patio, is in my name. I paid for it because it made sense at the time. I also covered school-related expenses, childcare gaps, and countless costs that were presented to me as temporary. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent when no one ever says no. I funded education accounts for the children because I wanted their future to be secure. I told myself it was an investment in family, not a transaction. I did not live with them, but I was present everywhere else. Every improvement, every upgrade, every quiet emergency had my fingerprints on it. What I did not notice at first was how rarely anyone asked what I thought. Decisions were made, plans announced, holidays organized, all without my input. I was informed, not included. I mistook that distance for independence. I told myself they were adults now and that stepping back was healthy. Still, something felt off. Invitations became vague. Conversations became rushed. I was useful, but I was no longer central. When I did see them, gratitude felt assumed rather than expressed. I kept giving because stopping felt unthinkable. I had built my identity around being needed, and I was afraid of what might remain if I was not. There were moments, late at night, when the house was too quiet and my thoughts too loud, that a question crept in. I pushed it away every time, afraid of what it might lead to, but it waited patiently, growing heavier with each passing month. I began to wonder, not angrily but honestly, what would happen if I stopped paying for the life they were living. I wondered whether my place in the family rested on love or on something far more fragile. If you're still watching, and this opening feels uncomfortably familiar, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Because what looks like generosity at the beginning doesn't always end that way. Now let's move on to chapter 2. The evening it happened was quiet in the way only December evenings can be in Scottsdale. The air had cooled just enough to make the house feel still, and I was alone in my kitchen, rinsing dust from a small artificial pine I had bought earlier that day. I had planned to decorate it slowly, one ornament at a time, the way I always did. Christmas, to me, was never about spectacle. It was about presence, about showing up, even when life felt fractured. My phone buzzed on the counter. I almost ignored it. Group messages rarely meant anything urgent, and lately they made me feel like an observer rather than a participant. Still, I wiped my hands on a towel and glanced at the screen. The family group chat had a new message from Vanessa. It was short, carefully phrased, and polite enough to sting. Please do not come this Christmas. We want something calm, no drama. I read it once, then again, slower the second time, as if different pacing might change its meaning. My first instinct was confusion. I ran through recent conversations in my head, searching for a moment I might have missed. Had I complained? Offered an opinion that was not asked for? Pushed too hard to see the kids? Nothing came to mind. I had been careful. I had always been careful. The word that echoed was not Christmas. It was not even do not come. It was drama. I stood there, phone in hand, trying to understand when I had become something disruptive. The woman who paid for their roof, their pool maintenance, their school activities, the grandmother who rearranged her schedule to fit into the narrow spaces offered to her. I wondered what part of me had become so inconvenient. Then I saw it, a small icon beneath the message. Daniel had liked it. There was no follow-up call, no private message asking how I felt, no attempt to soften the blow or explain the reasoning, just that single gesture, quiet and definitive. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me, something subtle but permanent. It was not heartbreak. It was recognition. The like was agreement. It was alignment. It told me exactly where my son stood when forced to choose between discomfort and loyalty. I set the phone down and leaned against the counter, suddenly aware of how empty the house felt. This was not the first time I had been excluded. There had been dinners planned without me, decisions announced after they were already made, holidays shaped around convenience rather than connection. I had accepted all of it because I believed that love meant flexibility. I told myself that independence was healthy, that families change as children grow. What I had not admitted was how consistently I had been moved to the margins. What struck me most was the contrast. My presence could be declined, but my money never was. Tuition payments were still expected. Repairs still appeared as quiet emergencies. Contributions were accepted without hesitation, without discussion. Only I was negotiable. Standing there, staring at the unlit tree, I realized how cleanly the lines had been drawn. I did not reply that night. I did not argue or explain or ask for clarification. I stood in my kitchen and looked at the ornaments still in their box, each one tied to a memory I was no longer invited to create. The house was silent, but my thoughts were not. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided for years. If I was considered drama simply for existing, then what role had I really been playing in their lives? I turned off the lights, left the tree undecorated, and went to bed with the phone face down on the nightstand. Sleep did not come easily. Somewhere between wakefulness and exhaustion, I understood that the message was not about Christmas at all. It was a line in the sand. And once I saw it clearly, I knew that nothing could go back to the way it had been. If you're still here and starting to sense that something deeper is being hidden beneath the surface, comment number 2 below. The warning signs are subtle, but they matter. Let's move on to chapter 3. I woke before sunrise the morning after the message, my mind already alert, my body tense in a way it had not been in years. The house was still dark, the kind of quiet that usually comforted me, but that morning it felt heavy. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that single word again, sitting there so neatly in Vanessa's message, as if it were harmless. Drama. I lay there staring at the ceiling, aware that something fundamental had shifted. I did not feel emotional or panicked. I felt clear. On the first weekday of every month, I followed the same routine. Coffee, laptop, bank account. I reviewed balances, scheduled transfers, confirmed that everything was in place. It was a habit formed over years, as automatic as brushing my teeth. Supporting Daniel's household had become a line item in my life, predictable and unquestioned. I told myself it gave them stability. I told myself it was temporary. That morning, I sat at my desk with my coffee growing cold and did not log in right away. When I finally opened the banking portal, the familiar numbers appeared on the screen. There it was, the scheduled transfer that covered their monthly expenses, already queued and waiting. All it required was a click. I hovered over the mouse longer than I expected to. I did not feel angry. I felt aware. For the first time, I understood that continuing meant agreeing to the terms that had been set for me without my consent. I canceled the transfer. The confirmation message appeared, brief and unemotional. The system did not ask for justification. It did not warn me about consequences. It simply accepted my decision. My heart began to pound, not with fear, but with adrenaline. I sat back in my chair and let the moment settle. This was not a gesture. It was an action. And actions, unlike words, have weight. Within an hour, my phone began to vibrate. I did not need to look to know who it was. Missed calls stacked up from Daniel, then messages from Vanessa, their tones shifting quickly from confusion to concern. I did not open any of them. Silence felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, but I held it. I knew that if I answered, I would slip back into explaining, apologizing, smoothing things over. I had done that my entire adult life. Instead, I stayed where I was and opened the folders I had not looked at closely in years. Statements, account summaries, tuition invoices, credit card records. Each document told the same story with brutal clarity. Every major expense tied to their life flowed through me. Every account was in my name. None of it was required. None of it was legally binding. I had not been supporting them because I had to. I had been doing it because I believed I should. As the morning went on, the messages increased. Vanessa's words became sharper, less careful. Daniel's calls grew more frequent. I imagined the moment they realized something was wrong, the brief confusion turning into panic. I did not feel satisfaction. What I felt was distance, as if I were finally standing outside a storm I had lived inside for years. I reviewed the secondary credit cards I had added to my account, the ones Vanessa used for groceries, household purchases, and expenses she labeled as work-related. I paused, then disabled them one by one. Each confirmation felt like turning a valve, slowly and deliberately. I did not rush. I did not hesitate either. This was not punishment. It was correction. By midday, the house was still quiet, but my phone was not. I placed it face down on the desk and looked out the window at the bright Arizona sky. For the first time, I understood the scale of what I had done. The flow of money that had sustained their lifestyle had stopped. Whatever came next would not be theoretical. It would be immediate, and it would be real. I closed my laptop and stood up, aware that this was only the beginning. Cutting the money was not the end of the conflict. It was the moment that made everything else unavoidable. If you're still watching and wondering how long someone can stay silent before it becomes betrayal, comment number 3 below, because what happens next changes the balance completely. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. After the money stopped moving, something unexpected happened inside me. The panic I thought would arrive never did. Instead, there was a quiet, steady clarity, the kind that comes when denial finally loosens its grip. I understood instinctively that calling Daniel or responding to Vanessa would only pull me back into the familiar cycle of explanations and emotional bargaining. If I reached out now, I would end up apologizing for boundaries I had every right to set. I did not need another conversation. I needed the truth. For the first time, I chose not to look inward or downward, but outward. I did not ask my family what was happening to me. I sought people who had no emotional investment in keeping the peace. I scheduled a meeting with an attorney whose practice focused on elder financial abuse, a term that made me uncomfortable even as I typed it into a search bar. Sitting in his office a few days later, I felt strangely detached, as if I were explaining someone else's life rather than my own. The lawyer listened without interruption as I laid out the facts. I described the house, the ongoing support, the education accounts, the credit cards. I explained how none of it had ever been formalized, how every dollar was given freely, without conditions. When I finished, he reviewed the documents I had brought and told me, calmly and clearly, that I had no legal obligation to continue. Everything I had done was voluntary. Hearing that did not bring relief. It brought disorientation. I realized how deeply I had internalized responsibility that was never legally or morally mine. He did not use dramatic language. He did not accuse my son or my daughter-in-law outright. He simply explained patterns. How often older parents confuse love with obligation. How easily generosity becomes expectation. How financial dependence can quietly distort family dynamics until no one remembers how it began. I left his office with a folder of notes and a feeling I could not yet name. That afternoon, I attended a meeting of a local group for widowed women over 60. I had driven past the community center dozens of times and never once considered going in. Now, I sat in a circle with women who looked ordinary and composed until they began to speak. One by one, stories emerged that mirrored my own. Adult children who framed support as entitlement. Mothers labeled controlling when they questioned expenses. Grandmothers slowly edged out of family life once their usefulness became purely financial. Listening to them, I felt something shift. My experience was not unique. It was recognizable. For the first time, I allowed myself to use the words I had avoided: financial exploitation, emotional coercion. Naming it did not make it easier, but it made it clearer. I was not overreacting. I was responding to a pattern that had been forming for years. The final confirmation came unexpectedly. While reviewing old documents at home, I noticed a reference to a wellness investment tied loosely to my name. Curious, I followed the trail. What I found stopped me cold. Vanessa had used a scanned version of my signature from an outdated file to imply my financial backing for a spa project she was involved in. I had never agreed to it. I had never even been asked. Seeing my name attached to something I did not authorize sent a chill through me. Shock gave way to something steadier. This was no longer about hurt feelings or holiday plans. This was about boundaries that had been crossed deliberately. The discomfort I had been ignoring finally made sense. I was not imagining things. I was not being sensitive. I was being used. That night, I sat alone in my living room, documents spread across the table, and felt a strange sense of resolve take hold. I was done guessing. From this point on, I would move with information, not hope. Whatever came next, I would face it with open eyes and a strategy grounded in truth. If you're still here and realizing this was never just a misunderstanding, comment number 4 below. The truth is about to surface, and there's no turning back. Let's continue to Chapter 5. After I uncovered the truth about the unauthorized use of my name, I stopped reacting altogether. I watched instead. Silence, I was learning, had a way of pulling people into the open. When the money did not resume and my calls did not come, the atmosphere on the other side began to shift. Confusion hardened into irritation, and irritation quietly turned into strategy. Vanessa was the first to adjust. It did not happen directly. There were no messages addressed to me, no clear accusations. Instead, her social media presence changed tone. Posts appeared about emotional boundaries, about freeing oneself from controlling relationships, about the courage it takes to protect one's peace. Nothing named me, yet everything pointed in my direction. Friends I barely knew began reacting with sympathetic comments. I scrolled through them with a calm I did not expect, recognizing the performance for what it was. What unsettled me was not the content itself, but the ease with which she shaped the narrative. She presented herself as restrained, thoughtful, even burdened by the need to distance herself from negativity. Meanwhile, the practical details of her life had not changed. The house was still occupied. Expenses were still being charged until the cards failed. The image of independence was carefully curated while dependence continued behind the scenes. Daniel said nothing. He did not contradict her publicly. He did not contact me privately. His absence was louder than any argument could have been. I had spent years telling myself that he avoided conflict, that silence was his way of keeping peace. Now I saw it differently. Silence was not neutral. It was alignment without accountability. I found myself revisiting old memories, moments I had dismissed at the time. Vanessa steering conversations away from finances when I was present. Daniel deferring to her even on matters that affected me directly. The pieces had always been there. I had simply refused to assemble them. It was easier to believe in harmony than to confront imbalance. The final confirmation arrived quietly, in the form of an email from someone I did not recognize at first. She introduced herself as a former friend of Vanessa, someone who had distanced herself years earlier. Her message was brief and hesitant, but its purpose was clear. She felt compelled to share information that now seemed relevant. Attached were screenshots of old conversations, time-stamped and unambiguous. I read them slowly, once, then again. In them, Vanessa spoke with a casual certainty that took my breath away. She described her long-term plans, her patience framed not as love, but as endurance. She referred to me not as family, but as a resource that required management. The goal was stability first, separation later. The tone was not cruel. It was efficient. I did not cry. What I felt was colder and more clarifying than grief. The betrayal was not emotional. It was strategic. That distinction mattered. It explained why no amount of understanding or compromise had ever shifted the dynamic. I had been responding with emotion to a situation governed by calculation. For a brief moment, I wondered if I should forward the email to Daniel, if seeing it might wake him from whatever version of reality he was clinging to. Then I stopped myself. Understanding does not come to those who are not ready to accept it. If he had ignored every sign until now, one more would not change the pattern. Sitting alone that evening, I realized something else. This was not about me being excluded from Christmas or labeled as difficult. Those were surface symptoms. The real issue was that I had mistaken proximity for connection and generosity for loyalty. Vanessa's mask had slipped not because she made a mistake, but because the circumstances no longer supported the performance. The calm I felt surprised me. I was no longer searching for ways to repair what had been broken. I was preparing to decide what would come next. Whatever choice I made, it would not be based on guilt or hope. It would be based on clarity, and clarity, once gained, does not fade. Once the truth settled in, it did not arrive with noise or fury. It arrived with weight, a heavy, unmoving clarity that followed me from room to room, from morning into night. I no longer felt confused about what had happened or why. The questions that used to circle endlessly in my mind had finally fallen silent. There was nothing left to interpret. I saw the situation exactly as it was, and that knowledge changed everything. For days, I lived inside that stillness, aware that I stood at a crossroads that could not be avoided. On one side was the path I had always taken. I could resume the support, smooth things over, pretend that the last few weeks had been a misunderstanding amplified by stress. I could tell myself that keeping the family together was worth any personal cost. I knew exactly how to do that. I had practiced it for years. It would require swallowing my pride, my anger, and my sense of self. But it would restore a familiar version of peace. On the other side was a path I had never taken. It meant accepting conflict, loss, and judgment. It meant acknowledging that love alone could not fix what had been built on dependence and manipulation. Choosing that path would almost certainly cost me my closeness to Daniel. It could limit my access to my grandchildren. It would expose me to criticism from people who would never know the full story. Most frightening of all, it would force me to live without the identity I had worn for decades, the identity of the endlessly giving mother. I tried to imagine both futures in detail. In the first, I saw myself aging quietly, still useful, still included, but always careful, always adjusting to remain acceptable. In the second, I saw uncertainty but also space to exist without negotiating my worth, space to make choices that did not require approval. The difference between them was not comfort. It was integrity. I returned to the lawyer's office with a different posture than before. This time, I did not come seeking reassurance. I came prepared to act. We reviewed options again, slowly and deliberately. Continuing support would change nothing. Delaying would only invite further boundary testing. The law was clear, but more importantly, so was my responsibility to myself. Doing nothing was not neutral. It was a decision to allow the pattern to continue. As we talked, I realized something that startled me. My greatest fear was not losing Daniel. It was losing myself while trying to keep him. I had already felt what that erosion was like. Each compromise had taken something from me, something I never quite got back. If I stepped back now, I would be confirming what they already believed, that my limits were flexible, that my discomfort could always be managed. The moment of choice did not feel dramatic. It felt quiet and firm. I chose the path that ended the cycle. I chose to stop negotiating my boundaries. I chose to let consequences unfold rather than intercept them. When I said it out loud, My voice did not shake. There was no relief, but there was certainty. Driving home, I prepared myself for what would follow: anger, accusations, attempts to pull me back into familiar roles. I knew they would come, but beneath that anticipation was something new, something steady. I was no longer reacting, I was directing. That night, I sat alone in my living room and looked around with fresh eyes. The space felt different, not emptier, but more honest. I understood that from this point forward, nothing would be resolved by affection alone. Love without respect had brought me here. Whatever remained would have to be built on something stronger. If you're still watching and felt the weight of that decision, comment number 6 below to let me know you're still with me, because the consequences don't come quietly. Let's move on to chapter 7. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They crept in quietly, then gathered momentum, like a tide that reveals itself only when it is already too strong to ignore. I knew this would happen. I had prepared myself for it in theory. Living through it was something else entirely. The first signs came through the cracks: payments that did not go through, plans that suddenly required reevaluation, schedules that no longer worked without the financial padding I had always provided. I did not hear about these things directly at first. I sensed them through the change in tone, the urgency that crept into messages that were no longer confident or assumptive. What once felt routine now felt strained. Daniel reached out after several days of silence. The distance in his voice was gone, replaced by tension he could not disguise. There was no anger this time, no attempt to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding. He spoke as someone who had run into a wall he did not know existed. The world he had been moving through with ease had abruptly become rigid, governed by rules he had never learned to navigate. As I listened, I felt the familiar pull in my chest, the instinct to fix, to smooth, to step in before things fell apart. That instinct had shaped decades of my life, but something had changed. I could hear the difference between hardship and accountability. I could hear that what he was facing was not cruelty inflicted by me, but reality catching up to choices long deferred. He spoke about applications that had been rejected and plans that no longer aligned. He described pressure without fully acknowledging its origin. There was still an expectation beneath his words, subtle but present, that I would intervene, that I always had. I recognized that expectation not as entitlement, but as learned dependence, and I understood, with a clarity that hurt, how much I had contributed to it. Vanessa's reaction followed a different pattern. Her frustration manifested as blame, redirected outward, sharp and unyielding. The strain inside their household intensified as the financial buffer disappeared. I did not need details to know that tension had found a new target. When resources dry up, the dynamics they once masked tend to surface. I stayed where I was. I did not step in. I did not offer solutions or compromises. I did not justify my decision or defend it. Holding that line required more strength than any argument ever had. Each time I felt myself waver, I reminded myself that this was not punishment. It was consequence. I was not taking something away. I was no longer preventing reality from doing its work. Watching my son struggle was painful in a way that cut deeper than anger. I wanted to shield him, as I always had. But I also saw something else, something I had never seen before. For the first time, Daniel was standing in front of a problem he could not outsource. There was no quick transfer, no quiet solution handled behind the scenes. The responsibility sat squarely with him. That realization brought a complicated mix of grief and resolve. I grieved the illusion that my help had always been helpful. I grieved the years in which protection had quietly become limitation. At the same time, I felt an unfamiliar steadiness. Growth, I was learning, often begins where rescue ends. As the days passed, I held on to that truth. I loved my son. That had never changed. But love did not mean intercepting every fall. Sometimes it meant stepping back and allowing the ground to teach what comfort never could. After the initial shock settled, what followed was not chaos, but a slow, grinding tension, the kind that lingers beneath every conversation, shaping words before they are spoken. Daniel and Vanessa did not retreat. Instead, they shifted tactics. Messages became more measured, less reactive. The urgency softened into something that resembled negotiation, as if the situation were a misunderstanding that could be corrected with the right conversation. Daniel reached out again, this time asking to meet. There was a seriousness in his tone that had not been there before, a recognition that whatever had been lost would not return through silence alone. Still, beneath that seriousness, I sensed the familiar hope that I might step in and restore balance the way I always had. I did not respond immediately. I needed to be certain that I was not confusing dialogue with retreat. When I agreed to meet, I made one condition clear to myself before anything else. This would not be a private conversation governed by emotion and history. I would not sit alone across from my son and absorb the weight of his stress, as I had done so many times before. I arranged for my lawyer to be present. That decision alone marked a shift. It signaled that this was no longer about smoothing feelings. It was about structure. The meeting was restrained and careful. There were no raised voices, no dramatic declarations. The absence of emotional theatrics made everything feel more exposed. Daniel spoke about pressure, about how quickly things had unraveled once the financial support stopped. He acknowledged, for the first time, that he had relied on me far more than he had admitted. It was not a confession of wrongdoing, but it was a step toward honesty. Vanessa sat beside him, visibly tense. Her frustration surfaced in subtle ways, redirected toward circumstance rather than responsibility. She spoke about sudden changes and unfair timing, framing the situation as something imposed rather than created. I listened without interruption. I did not argue. I did not correct her narrative. I simply did not absorb it. When it was my turn, I spoke plainly. I explained that what had ended was not support, but a pattern that had become unhealthy for everyone involved. I outlined the boundaries that would not be crossed again. There would be no informal financial assistance, no shared credit, no assumptions of access. These were not punishments. They were protections, long overdue. What surprised me was how calm I felt saying it. I was not defending myself. I was not seeking understanding. I was stating terms. That distinction mattered. For years, I had equated love with flexibility, believing that firmness would fracture relationships. Now I understood that flexibility without limits had already done that damage. The meeting ended without resolution in the traditional sense. There were no apologies that healed old wounds, no promises that everything would improve. But there was clarity. The expectations that had once hovered unspoken were now visible, defined, and immovable. Whether they accepted them or not was no longer my responsibility. Driving home afterward, I reflected on what moving forward truly meant. It did not mean returning to what had been. It meant allowing something new to exist, even if it was quieter and less familiar. I did not know what my relationship with my son would become. I only knew that it would no longer be built on unspoken obligations. For the first time, the uncertainty ahead did not frighten me. I was no longer waiting for permission to protect myself. Whatever shape the future took, I would meet it from solid ground, not from the margins. If you're still here and want to see how this story truly ends, comment number 8 below. The final outcome may not be what you expect, but it says everything. Now let's move on to the conclusion. When everything finally settled, it did not do so with drama or final arguments. It ended quietly, almost politely, as if exhaustion had replaced outrage on all sides. Daniel and Vanessa moved out of the house without ceremony. There were no last-minute pleas or confrontations, no lingering attempts to reopen negotiations. Boxes were loaded, keys were returned, and a chapter that had consumed years of my life closed with an unsettling calm. I walked through the house after they left, room by room, taking in the emptiness. Without furniture and noise, the space felt larger and strangely neutral. The walls held echoes of birthday parties, hurried mornings, and holidays I had funded but not fully shared. I expected the silence to feel painful. Instead, it felt honest. For the first time, the house was not asking anything of me. A few days later, I decided to sell it. Not out of anger or spite, but because I understood that keeping it would tether me to a version of myself that no longer existed. I did not want reminders disguised as investments. I wanted closure that did not require daily maintenance. Signing the papers felt decisive, not impulsive. It was a practical step toward leaving the past where it belonged. I moved into a smaller place in a community better suited to where I was now. The change in scale mirrored the change in my life. There were no expectations built into the walls, no assumptions about who I was supposed to support or sustain. My days became quieter, shaped by routines I chose rather than obligations I managed. I noticed how much time I had once spent reacting, adjusting, and anticipating needs that were never truly mine. The distance between Daniel and me remained. We spoke occasionally, carefully, as if both of us were learning a new language without a shared dictionary. The closeness we once had did not return, and I stopped waiting for it to. Accepting that loss was not easy, but it was clean. There was no longer confusion about where I stood or what was expected of me. Grief still surfaced at unexpected moments. It arrived in memories, and the realization that some things could not be repaired simply because time had passed. But the grief no longer came with resentment or self-blame. I had done what I could with the information I had at the time. That understanding softened the edges of regret. I began doing things I had postponed for years. I signed up for painting classes without explaining why. I planned a trip I had once dismissed as impractical. I filled my time with activities that did not need to be justified by usefulness. Each choice felt small, but together they formed a life that belonged to me. What surprised me most was the absence of guilt. I had expected it to follow me, to whisper that I had failed in some essential role. Instead, there was a sense of alignment I had not felt before. My actions finally matched my values. I was no longer giving to earn a place. I was living from one. In the evenings, I sat in my new living room and noticed how different the quiet felt. It was not empty. It was spacious. It held possibility rather than obligation. The ending I reached was not the one I had imagined for myself, but it was real. And for the first time in a long while, real felt like enough. Life did not return to normal after everything ended. It became something else entirely, quieter, slower, and far more honest. In that quiet, I found space to look back on what had happened without the haze of fear or guilt. Distance has a way of sharpening truth, and what I saw was not a single betrayal, but a long pattern I had helped sustain by refusing to stop giving. The phrase, "no drama," stayed with me longer than I expected. At first it hurt because it felt dismissive. Over time, I understood what it really meant. It was not a desire for peace. It was a desire for convenience. Drama, in that context, meant discomfort. It meant questions. It meant someone finally noticing that the balance was unfair. When people say they want no drama, what they often mean is that they do not want to be challenged. I also learned something difficult about motherhood. Love without limits does not always protect. Sometimes it weakens. By removing every obstacle from my son's path, I had also removed his chance to grow. By financing his independence, I had made him dependent. That realization hurt more than any accusation ever could, because it required me to acknowledge my role in what happened. Letting go of the identity of the endlessly sacrificing mother was unsettling. For so long, being needed had been how I measured my worth. Without that role, I had to redefine myself. I began to see that care does not require self-erasure, and generosity does not demand silence. Support, when it is healthy, does not come at the cost of dignity. My relationship with Daniel remains changed. There is still love, but it is quieter now, stripped of illusion. I no longer chase closeness by overextending myself. I allow the relationship to exist as it is, not as I wish it to be. That acceptance has been one of the hardest lessons of all. If there is anything I would say to other women standing where I once stood, it is this. Setting boundaries does not make you cruel. Choosing yourself does not make you selfish. You are allowed to stop giving when giving begins to harm you. Some family stories do not end in reconciliation. Mine did not. But it ended in truth, and that matters. I wake each day knowing that my life belongs to me again. And that knowledge, earned through loss and courage, feels like freedom. Sometimes, the hardest endings are not loud or dramatic. They arrive quietly, after everything has already been said and done. What remains is not victory or defeat, but clarity. Clarity about where love ends and self-respect must begin. When giving turns into self-erasure, when silence is mistaken for peace, something essential is lost. This story is not about punishment or revenge. It is about awakening, about realizing that boundaries are not walls, but acts of honesty. Life does not ask us to sacrifice ourselves to be worthy of love. It asks us to be whole. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own experience or choices, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. And if you would like to hear more stories like this, consider following and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these conversations alive.